Now, I noted that we have named this series Navigating Freedom in a Multi-Religious Democracy. So it's fair to ask as we start our program, what do we mean by multi-religious democracy, and do we in fact even have one? And one of the things that we're going to learn today and in our subsequent programs is that the United States is in fact one of the most religiously pluralistic nations on earth. Ours is a democracy that's inclusive of people of literally hundreds of different faiths. Now, we didn't become a multi-religious democracy recently, nor do we become a multi-religious democracy accidentally. Plurality of faiths is baked into the history of our country. Consider this: the very first religion practiced in what is we now call the United States were the shared spiritual practices of indigenous peoples, Native Americans who established the very first communities on the North American continent. And when Spanish explorers came here in the 1400s, they brought with them their own religion. It was Catholicism. And as other European nations began to colonize in North America, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, and the English, they planted competing forms of Christianity here on this land. Some were Catholics and some were Protestants, and many were very fervent about the superiority of their faith over others. In 1619, Europeans for the first time brought enslaved Africans to North America, and these Africans had their own religious beliefs and spiritual practices. More than 15% of them, in fact, some people say as many as 25% of the enslaved people who were brought here by force were Muslims. Others had their own indigenously developed beliefs and belief systems which they brought with them to the continent. And as slavery expanded in North America for centuries afterwards, it was met with variously forced conversions, resistance on the part of the enslaved, and the persistence of African religious beliefs and practices. The first Jewish communities in our nation were established in the 1600s. And by the time that the colonists were declaring their freedom from Britain and contemplating what a new nation would look like that was founded on liberty, they were clear that religious freedom for all should be a part of it. But many of the founding fathers, as we know, considered entire groups of people, for example, enslaved Africans and indigenous people, were considered to be inherently inferior to what white people were, making the statement, liberty and justice for all, a tragic contradiction in our nation's founding. Now, in 1776, a date we all remember, but you may not know that something else important happened in 1776, and that is that the Virginia Constitutional Convention adopted the first Declaration of Rights in our nation. And in this Declaration of Rights, they declared, and I quote, "All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion in court according to the dictates of their conscience." Now, Thomas Jefferson, who had his hands in this, of course, commented on the Declaration of Rights in his autobiography, and he affirmed something very important, and that is that the authors, he said, of this declaration meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, meaning Muslim, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. In 1790, as you may know, George Washington quoted the Old Testament in a letter that he wrote to a Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, in which he said, he promised that under the new government, and I quote, everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. For happily, he said, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. And when the First Amendment to the new Constitution was ratified by the 13 colonies in 1791, the first freedom of the First Amendment was freedom of religion. The First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now we're all aware of the practical inconsistencies of our founding fathers. They didn't always practice what they preached. This, in fact, is a continuing struggle in our country. The United States has never fully realized the promise or the vision of religious freedom for all. But these aspirational founding documents, many of which I've quoted for you here, establish the legal and moral foundation for what a multi-religious democracy could, and I'll say should, look like. As time has gone on and the United States population has grown through immigration, religious diversity has only increased. 19th, 20th, and 21st century immigrants brought riches of culture, language, beliefs, and institutions to this nation. Eboo Patel refers to this as the genius of America. He said, when we say we are an immigrant nation, we mean more than just various religious and ethnic groups settled here in America, bringing with them their Hebrew prayers, for example, and their Hindu chants. We are recognizing the fact that the institutions they built benefited not just them and their communities, but also the common good. And here's how he closes this paragraph. The institutional expression of religious identity is the engine of American civil society. And in this current era of increasing mobility, now many of us locked down, we don't feel like this is an era of increasing mobility, but it is an era in which people, information travels more widely and more quickly than ever before. In this era, more and more Americans, especially young adults, are exercising their right to choose to change their religion, even when that sometimes means, and as we will see, it does, choosing not to affiliate with any religious organization at all. And so it is that we are living in a multi-religious democracy. We inherited it. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, our inheritance is, quote, a great world house in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, we are a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must somehow learn to live with one another in peace. And that is the objective of the series that we have started today, that we might learn better how to live, to work, to learn, and to thrive with our many differences. So as we proceed on our agenda today, we're going to hear, first of all, some important facts about religious pluralism in America today. And then we're also going to consider a framework for how we might more fully understand what religious identity is really about. We have two leaders in the field who are going to share information with us. They have some very interesting visuals to share. So if you haven't done so already, you may want to set your device on speaker view so that you can fully see what they have to offer you. You can just access the setting. I know on my computer, it's up in the top right-hand corner of the screen. Our first speaker is Natalie Jackson. She's the Director of Research with the Public Religion Research Institute. She's held senior and management positions in media, academia, and nonprofit organizations. Most recently, Natalie was the Managing Director of Polling at Just Capital, where she has built and managed a survey research team, as well as contributed to the overall mission and strategy of the organization. Natalie received her Ph.D. in political science from the University of Oklahoma and was a postdoctoral associate at the Duke University Initiative on Survey Methodology. Her work has appeared in peer-reviewed journals such as Electoral Studies and Social Science Quarterly, as well as in several edited volumes. So Natalie, welcome and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Give us some facts.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I am sharing my screen so that you can see the slides that I have. Everybody can see that? I see nods, so that's good. So a little bit about PRRI. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, political, religious, social policy, public opinion organization. So PRRI stands for Public Religion Research Institute. We are not exclusive to any one religion. Again, we're a nonprofit, we're nonpartisan, we're also the religion research is completely encapsulated. And one of the big things that we do is tracking how the American religious landscape is changing. Because even though we've always been a country of multiple religions, we've often been a majority white Christian country. And the reason that I specify white is that we see in our research that on a lot of social and political matters, there are fundamental differences by race. And some of that goes back to the history that Blair summarized. African-American churches grew in this nation in a fundamentally different way than white Christian churches did. So we reflect that history in the way we categorize religion. So you'll see some of that. Just to get going. First, I wanted to show you some research that we did last year on when and where people interact with people who are different from them. A lot of us I grew up in rural Texas. I was in graduate school before I met a Jewish person. We can grow up pretty isolated or, sometimes not. But it is interesting to see the differences in how Americans experience people who are different from them. So one of the questions we asked was, how frequently do you interact with people who do not share certain characteristics? We asked about race or ethnicity, religion, political party, and sexual orientation. And we see most people are interacting with people different from them at least once a week, somewhat less with sexual orientation, although, perhaps they simply are less aware that those differences are present. 60% of people report interacting with someone of a different religion at least once a week. The next thing we looked at was where those interactions happen. Now religion is the pink bar. The colors shifted between those two charts. But the most common place that people interact with people who are different from them is in the workplace. So it's obviously critically important for everyone to understand as we start careers, as we continue careers, you know, that how we interact with people in the workplace really matters for how we perceive a pluralistic society. A lot of people do also, almost half report having people of different religions in their friendship circles. Notably, this doesn't mean that those friendships are terribly close. It just says in my circles. And then somewhat less so, but we also see people interacting with people from different religions in their child's schools. We also asked if people view these various institutions as bringing people together or pushing people apart. And the one I wanted to highlight here is the third bar, the religious organizations. There's a lot of mixed feeling about whether religious organizations bring people together or push them apart. So that makes it a bit of a challenging discussion. And you notice that with other things like workplaces, the same proportion, 40% of people feel like workplaces bring people together, but there's not as much pushing people apart. We see more mixed views, more neither in that, so more kind of ambivalence. Political parties in the media are viewed as distinctly pushing people apart. Religious organizations and colleges and universities are kind of the most kind of touchy mix. Do they bring people together? Do they push them apart? A lot of you are existing in that intersection right now. So it's useful to kind of think about, as you see data like this, you know, this is representative of all Americans, but what does that look like for you? How would you classify yourself in this? Do you think your college or university and your religious organization, if you belong to one, do you feel like it's pulling people together or pushing them apart? So in 2013, we did this study where we dug in. Like I said, I noted earlier that our findings are not necessarily about close friendships. In this study that we did in 2013, we asked about close friendships. We had people list out 7 people that they were close to with whom they discussed important matters in the last week, as up to 7. For some it was 2, for some it was 1, for some it was more than 7. But we took up to 7 and asked about those people's religion, race, you know, different characteristics to classify, you know, how people were interacting with people different from them in more of a close-knit relationship. And we do see that among most religious groups, people are reporting that the people in their close social networks belong to similar religions, by and large. We're hoping to redo this. This data is a bit on the old side, and we're hoping to redo this and see how this has changed. With that as kind of a background, I'm going to shift over to what the country looks like. Like I said, we've seen a lot of shifting. In 1968, we actually helped a reporter find this number not long ago. In 1968, the country was about 80% white Christian. We've exploded in diversity of both race and ethnicity and religion and many other characteristics in the last 40 years. So as recently as 2000, we were still a majority Christian country. Now we're majority white Christian, I apologize. We're still majority Christian. So you can see here, 44% white Christian, now a plurality rather than a majority. 23% non-white Christian, which consists of Black, Hispanic, Asian American, Native American, multiracial, plus, any other racial group. That was not, the reason for that category is that it's large and it's blunt. The reason we do that in surveys sometimes is that we simply don't have large enough sample sizes to be confident in our results for some of the smaller categories. So that's why it's grouped together like that. But in some, we have 67% Christian. We have 24% unaffiliated. That's kind of our quickly moving group. The lack of affiliation, this includes agnostic, atheist, as well as just nothing in particular. Spiritual but not religious falls into this unaffiliated category as well. They have been growing over the last 15 years from about 15% to about 24% now. And then we have about 6% other world religions. This includes Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, anything else. And then, of course, with any survey, you have people who either say they don't know or they just don't want to share that information. So we do have 3% who just declined to state, which is fine. We accept that. To put the white Christian drop off in a little bit closer review, we have estimates for the percentage of white Christians in each state in 2007. You can see there are majorities in a lot of states. I believe the highest that I'm seeing is 74% in Kentucky. Using the same color scale, we can shift that to 2017, and you see the drop off. Like in Kentucky, the drop off wasn't huge. It went from 64 to 59. In some of these other states, Texas dropped from 45 to 35. California dropped from 34 to 24. So just the color scale is exactly the same, just to illustrate, we are becoming more diverse than we already were. A lot of this is happening with age. So this looks at our bulky kind of 4 categories of white Christian, non-white Christian, other religion, and unaffiliated by age. And we see that, young people are a lot more likely to be unaffiliated, 36%. Sorry, I disrupted the screen sharing for a second there. The panel's covering my number, so I needed to see it. 29% white Christian, 26% non-white Christian, 6% other religion, and then 36% unaffiliated. Among older Americans, that steadily increases. I'll come back to these Democrat and Republican bars in just a second. We dropped down to 15% of 65 plus, so seniors, are unaffiliated. Almost 60% are white Christian. So we see, a dramatic shift by age. And that's a lot of what's driving the overall change. Generational change will ultimately continue to reverberate. This year's 18 to 29-year-olds will become 10 years from now the 30 to 49-year-olds. And we'll see that reverberate throughout time. Now, the Democrat and Republican lines here are interesting because in this country, we would be remiss to talk about religion without talking about how it intersects very closely with partisanship. We see drastic differences between Democrats and Republicans in their religious affiliations. There's a lot of research done on what comes first. Is it that you align your church with your politics or your politics with your church? That's a matter with quite a bit of research in religion and politics. And you'll see arguments in both directions, depending on what stage of life people are selecting in and out of politics and religion. But we do see Democrats generally resemble younger Americans. Republicans generally resemble older Americans. Of course, these are general statements. They're not universally true. Of course, there are plenty of, 36% of Democrats are white Christians. We're just noting here that that jumps up to 67% for Republicans. We have 25% of Democrats that are unaffiliated. It drops down to 15% among Republicans. Now another notable aspect of age, which we somewhat saw on the last slide, but just to bring it out a little bit more, the proportion of religiously unaffiliated has increased among all age groups, but it's particularly pronounced among young Americans. The 18 to 29-year-old age group has become particularly likely to increase their share of unaffiliated relative to other religions. The data here stops at 2016. It has held steady since then. We're seeing a little bit of a slowdown in that unaffiliated pickup. We might be actually kind of settling out around 25% for the full American population. Or maybe that's just a temporary kind of plateau and then it continues to change. We'll be interested, PRRI will keep following that and we'll see what happens in the next few years. Coming back to the intersection of politics, just to show it a different way, really the primary two groups in politics that split firmly one way or the other. White Christians very firmly split Republican, and unaffiliateds pretty firmly go to the Democratic side. You can see almost mirror images in a lot of our work on policy issues. That's not to say there are not Democrats who are white Christian. There are, and you see here 30% of Democrats are white Christian, 13% of Republicans are unaffiliated. So we do see that the groups are mixed, but in general, when you look at policy positions, there are strong divides with these two groups. And then to show the change in a slightly different way, this is a lot, so let me walk you through it. On the left, we have 2006. Each bar, you see a bar for Republicans and a bar for Democrats. And this breaks out I've been talking so far in 4 kind of large categories of religious affiliation. This breaks out the affiliations more specifically and shows you how they align for the political parties. The blues are white Christian. The yellows and oranges are other Christians, Black Protestant, Hispanic Protestants, Hispanic Catholics. And we see those groups mostly falling to making up more of the Democrat coalition. And then in 2006, unaffiliateds were a pretty small proportion of both. You come over to the right and we have the same thing for 2019. And we see basically the Republicans have shifted somewhat. The biggest difference is the unaffiliated growth, which is also the biggest difference for the Democrats. So the story is the same there. Both are growing in proportion unaffiliated with either religion. We do see that, you know, the Black and Hispanic coalitions continue to make up a much larger chunk of the Democrats than the Republicans. One of the ways in which this matters is asking people whether they prefer more diversity or they prefer a Christian majority. So we see that Republicans mostly prefer a Christian majority or something somewhere in the middle. 85% are on this end of the scale. More than half of Democrats prefer religious diversity, which makes sense if you look at the makeup of the Democratic Party. So we do see how this plays out into our politics. Often Republicans will take positions that are more protective of Christian values. Democrats will seem more pluralistic. Questions like this tell us why that happens. Then I have just two final things that I'll show you. One is a question of, do you think life has mostly changed for the better or for the worse since the 1950s? Like I mentioned, in the last 40 years, we've had an explosion of diversity in many ways in this country. So this question is a little bit of a way of getting at the Make America Great Again type of sentiment. Do we want to go backwards? Is that kind of what we think? The green part is people saying that it's mostly changed for the worse since the 1950s. The blue is people saying it's mostly changed for the better. We see the close connection between Democrats and unaffiliated on the left side of the chart. Hispanic and Black groups and young people generally tend to think that society has changed more for the better. Older white and white Christian groups tend to think America has changed more for the worse. So it's just important to know, not making any normative statements about either of those positions, but it's just important to know the relative mindset of different groups. And then on a similar note, we asked, you know, do you think the impact of coming demographic changes, which will, you know, which means that we will no longer have any racial majority anywhere in our country, do you think this is mostly positive or mostly negative? We see a very similar pattern. By and large, Democrats, Black, Hispanic, religiously unaffiliated, those groups think these are positive changes. And once we get toward Republicans and white Christian groups, there's a little more mixed view. Only a couple have a majority saying it's negative, but the views are much more mixed. So with that, I will wrap up and say thank you, A, thank you for your time. And B, I hope this gives you a little bit of an understanding of kind of why we talk about religion with respect to politics, and kind of where we are as a country compared to where we've been. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie. That's so much to think about and try to figure out. There is one question in the chat, and please, if anyone else has questions, go ahead and key them in now. But one question says, will this data be available, or is it currently available on your website? Is the way we can share some of these charts with our participants?
Yes, so I pulled this from a variety of things, actually, so there's no one place on our website, but I am putting our website in the chat box. Most of this comes from our American Values Atlas, which I'm also putting in the chat box. You can go to that ava.prri.org, and you can actually play around. That's an interactive website where you can play around with the data. You won't see the charts that I just showed you, but you'll see places to go back to 2013 and look at religious affiliation. You can look at a few policy items that we ask about, and then our full reports are posted on our website, our regular website, prri.org.
Do we have any other questions? Anybody have questions for Natalie about the research or what it might mean?
I'm looking at one in the chat box.
All right.
The age ranges for the first few surveys that I talked about with the interactions, those were of all Americans. So that was 18 and up. So that covered, generally we break into 4 age ranges, 18 to 29, 30 to 49, 50 to 64, and 65 plus. All 4 of those were grouped together in what I showed you at first.
I wonder, and maybe you don't have the data to substantiate, but maybe you have opinions about why this huge explosion in religiously unaffiliated people, particularly among the 18 to 29 year old group. Are people leaving the religion that they were raised in? Or what do you think is happening? How can we explain that or understand it better?
It's several different trends kind of coming together. Some of it is leaving religion that they were raised in. Some of it is, if you ask them, they would not say they've necessarily fallen away. They just don't particularly identify with that as part of their identity. So there are a lot of kind of different schools of thought. No one has really, this is another one of those places where religion research is still ongoing to see kind of where exactly these people have come from, because the limits we have in surveys like what we do at PRRI is we're depending on people, what they tell us now, whereas the ideal way to do that would be to track people and ask them when, know how they grew up and then track them throughout their life cycle. Which brings me, I do see a question in the chat box about people becoming more religious as they get older. And that is one of the trends that sometimes happens. Kind of some of the life cycle research has shown that people, when they begin to have children, sometimes turn back to the religion that they grew up in, or choose a different form of religion perhaps, but become more religious again at that point, and then throughout, and then that continues throughout the rest of their life. So it will be interesting to see how this younger cohort right now kind of, does that phenomenon continue to happen? We've noted that in the past, but does that continue as we move forward? And I see another question here. Are the unaffiliated on the right not atheist or agnostic? So like our unaffiliated category consists of atheist, agnostic, as well as just nothing in particular. We don't really notice a difference between the atheist and agnostic proportions in the Democrats versus Republicans. I think the determinant of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're unaffiliated, is happening somewhere else. and that I just don't have full information on. So that's not a very satisfying answer. I'm sorry, but that's there's not necessarily a difference between the proportions of atheist and agnostic.
You know, the chart you showed us with, do people prefer a white Christian country as opposed to people who actually prefer a more pluralistic country? I was really taken aback by some of those proportions of people who actually would prefer a country that was white Christian. And I guess that maybe explains why it's so hard to have reasonable conversations about immigration.
Yeah, and immigration is a key area where we do see a lot of difference based on religion and partisanship, especially in the last few years. You know, it's become a very prominent part of the Trump administration's agenda, and so we've seen even more division kind of erupt there. I will say that in that case, the white Christian groups are a little bit more mixed. You have white evangelical Protestants who are more kind of on the far Republican side of that issue. And then white mainline Protestants and white Catholics are more centrist.
Huh. Interesting observation from Charles Butler. I go to science fiction conventions, which have become, now there's an interesting statement in and of itself, which have become a faith base for many younger people. So it's a group of sort of like-minded folks. And I can understand why people find home in Star Trek and Star Wars when Republican values seem to be anti-science as well as pro-religion. Interesting.
And certainly that is, you know, one way in which the parties are perceived as different on religious issues. There is sometimes a perception that Republicans are pro-religion and Democrats are anti-religion. There can be definitely that's part of kind of the cultural tension that we feel in the country right now. Another question, do you ever measure any interventions to see what's changing folks' views? We don't usually get an opportunity to do that. Unfortunately, we have looked at some trend data. Basically what we do is we try to ask the same questions over time and see if things change. But we are not able usually to look at any interventions. Then another question, what are the dominant factors in people leaving religion? Political, economic, social, or spiritual? You know, that's one place where it's very personal to each person. And so if you talk to someone who had left religion, you would probably get some combination of all of the above. If you if you ask people to pick one, to say what was the most dominant, you would probably get pretty mixed. Some people it would be social, some people it would be spiritual, some people it would be just bad experiences. So I'd say that's a very, very mixed reasoning.
So before we move on, I'd just like to comment on something else that has come up in the chat about Christian domination or dominionism. And just to point out, this is a plug for our program next Thursday at this time, where we're going to talk about people's experiences with religious freedom. And we do have a presentation and an opportunity to chat about Christian nationalism. What is that, and exactly, and why are people talking about it so much these days? So Natalie, thank you so much. And this has been very illuminating and gives us all a lot to think about. I know I'm going to be chewing on some of these figures that you've shared with us, but we're going to move on now to our second presenter, who is Ben Marcus. And Natalie has shared with us some categories, religious categories, that are typically used when we want to understand what traditions and what religious identities people have. Ben is going to challenge us with a new kind of framework to help us rethink how we describe people's religious identities. Ben Marcus is the religious literacy specialist for the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum, where his special area of interest is the intersection of education, religious literacy, and identity formation in the United States. Ben has developed and delivered religious literacy programs for public schools, universities, businesses, government organizations, and private foundations, and he's delivered presentations on religion and education in the United States and abroad. He's worked closely with the U.S. State Department, the International Baccalaureate, the Interfaith Youth Corps, and the Cambridge Interfaith Program in the United Kingdom. He's a special advisor to the Foundation for Religious Literacy. Ben earned an MTS degree with a concentration in religion, ethics, and politics at Harvard Divinity School. He studied religion at the University of Cambridge and Brown University. And next month, he begins his studies at Yale Law School, and he's going to continue on, thank goodness, with the Freedom Forum as a fellow. So Ben's going to begin his presentation with a short video that a friend and associate of his, actually, Andrew Hendry, developed and has posted on his YouTube channel, which is called Religion for Breakfast. And we'll just give a plug to that channel and encourage any of you who would like to really delve more deeply into some of these religion issues to visit that. So Ben, thank you so much. Take it away from here.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here, and I'll share my screen now to find the video that we can use for today's discussion. Let's see. Right. Oops. Can everyone see this video? Can you see this, Blair? Okay, great. So,
in an earlier video, we analyzed the debate between Ben Affleck and Bill Maher to see how religious literacy could have helped everyone gain a richer understanding about religion. But one subscriber pointed out, sure, great, religious literacy is a fine and noble goal, but how the heck am I supposed to learn everything about religion? I have my own life to live. I have my own hobbies and my own interests. There's just no time in the day to go study everything about religion. And I totally agree. When I say that society should be trying to boost religious literacy, I definitely don't mean trying to learn every minute detail about religion. Religious literacy is not just knowing facts, but it's a method for how we approach topics about religion. At the forefront of developing this method is Harvard University's Religious Literacy Project. They have an online class, which I'm linking in the description below, that narrows this method down to 3 fundamental assumptions that everyone should know about religion. The first one is that religions are internally diverse as opposed to uniform. Now, I talk a little bit about this in the Bill Maher versus Ben Affleck video, but it bears repeating. each religion is incredibly diverse. Now, of course, there are big divisions like Christianity being subdivided into Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism, or Islam subdivided into Sunnis and Shias, but there are cultural differences too. A Hindu born and raised in India might practice or perceive their religion differently than a Hindu born and raised in the United States. But even on a regional level, there are huge differences. Evangelical Christians living in Boston will differ from evangelical Christians living in Nebraska, or evangelical Christians living in central Pennsylvania. Even though they might share the same creed, differences in politics and demographics and income levels might shape different expressions of their commonly held religion. But there is even diversity within a single religious community. In a single church of 100 people, you might have 100 different motivations for being there. You might have individuals that no longer believe in God, or people that hold so-called heretical beliefs that are outside of Christian orthodoxy. All this to say that even in a single local religious community, we can't say that they all speak with one voice. When we recognize that religions are diverse on a global, regional, and even local level, red alert signals should be blaring in your ears when you hear some pundit say, all Buddhists are nonviolent, or Christians vote Republican. Sure, this might be true for certain groups, but the statements are just so generalized they're not that accurate. The second point is that religions evolve and change over time, as opposed to being ahistorical and static. Alright, I admit that this also might be way too obvious to repeat, but many people don't appreciate the significance of what this means. Our religions have been around for a long time, and they are products of their historical context. This means that religions' beliefs and doctrines and theologies have changed significantly over the course of centuries. The Religious Literacy Project, which I mentioned earlier, uses the example of slavery, how the three big Abrahamic religions have reinterpreted slavery over the course of centuries, first justifying it, but now here in the 21st century denouncing it. Theologies change over time too. Before the 19th century, you would have had a hard time finding a Christian who believed in the rapture. It just wasn't a well-defined doctrine. But now, especially after the wildly popular Left Behind series in the 1990s, this doctrine is pretty common among evangelical Christians. Another modern example would be the Southern Baptist Convention's changing stance on abortion. In June of 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution allowing the possibility of abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. And 30 years later, in their 2003 convention, the Southern Baptists determined that the leadership in the 1970s were espousing a non-biblical view on abortion, and worked instead to outlaw it completely. All of these examples are to show that religions are not just internally diverse, but they are historically diverse too. At every moment of time throughout history, religions constantly undergo reinterpretation by their living adherents. And number 3, religious influences are embedded in all dimensions of culture, as opposed to functioning only in the private sphere of social life. Now, this one's a little bit more complicated, so let's try to unpack it. We often think of religion as something personal. It's a decision that you as an individual makes, and you as an individual practices in your own personal life. But in actuality, it is impossible to separate religion from its cultural context. Quoting the Religious Literacy Project, in the same way that race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic class are always factors in cultural interpretation and understanding, so too is religion. No matter what facet of culture you're looking at, art, politics, even etiquette, clothing, and food, you will always find religious influences. So for example, consider something as mundane as the calendar in the United States. Even though the US government is secular, Christianity is embedded in our calendar. Government offices are closed on Sundays. Christmas is a national holiday. Christianity is also embedded in US cityscapes. Looking out over Boston, I see church steeples everywhere, in the same way that we see minarets everywhere looking out over the skyline of Istanbul. When we recognize that religion is embedded in every facet of our culture, and not just relegated to our private lives, we'll be better equipped to understand when these religious influences are at work. So these are the 3 basic assumptions that I feel lay the groundwork for being a religiously literate person. If you understand that religions are internally diverse, historically diverse, and religion is embedded in every aspect of our culture, then you'll be equipped to approach any topic about religion. Sure, knowing every minute detail about religion is great, but I understand that we're busy people and there's no shame at all taking this shortcut. As always, thanks for watching and subscribing, and I'll see you next time. So as I said, these 3 assumptions come from the Harvard Religious Literacy Project.
All right, so if you all are not familiar with Religion for Breakfast, I would strongly recommend that you check Andrew Henry's YouTube channel out. It's on YouTube. If you just Google Religion for Breakfast, you'll find his series. He has dozens of videos related to different questions related to religion. He has some Religion 101 videos, like this one that you just saw that provide an overview of some basic premises or theories and methods in the academic study of religion. And then he has videos about specific religious traditions and specific topics in the study of religion. So we'll be happy to post a link to the YouTube video as well. So what I'll be talking about today is the complexity of religious identity. We heard from Natalie earlier about the changing religious landscape in the United States. So I want to take a look at how a framework for thinking about the changing religious landscape and for thinking about the complexity of religion, not only at the level of how people affiliate with different religious communities, but also what it means when they affiliate with those religious communities. For what reasons are they claiming a specific religious identity? Is it just because of the things that they believe? Is it also because of the ways that they behave in sacred ritual settings and in their daily life? And is it also related to the communities that they're part of? And what are those communities? So that's what I'll be looking at in the next 15 or so minutes. So I'm going to share my screen and show a slide deck here. We're going to start with thinking, picking up, I think, where Natalie left off with the changing religious landscape. I want to explore, why is religious literacy necessary? How is this helpful? The first point that I want to make is that the American Academy of Religion, which is the largest learned society for scholars who study religion in the world, released some guidelines in 2010 that explain what religious literacy is and why it's important. They say that religious literacy is important because they hypothesize that teaching about religion can decrease the bigotry and prejudice that fuel violence. Or to put that in a positive way, that increasing religious literacy provides us with the tools and resources that we need to live more productively with our deepest differences. And so for us at the Religious Freedom Center, we agree with that hypothesis that teaching about religion can decrease the bigotry and prejudice that fuel violence. This is important because, as we saw earlier, there's increasing religious diversity in the United States. And unfortunately, with that increasing religious diversity, we're also seeing an increase in religion-related hate crimes and an increase in hate groups. So there are a number of different organizations that track religion-related hate crimes in the United States. They have different definitions for hate crimes. They have different definitions for hate groups. So their numbers vary a little bit. But what's important for our purposes today is that they agree on a certain trend. And unfortunately, it's a worrying trend that just looking at the FBI data, for example, we've seen an increase on average in religion-related hate crimes over this 4-year period from 2014 to 2018. So we saw an increase in anti-Jewish hate crimes, an increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes in that 4-year period. And we think it's important to teach about religion because we agree with the AAR that our hope is that by teaching about religion, we can help decrease the bigotry and prejudice that fuel this kind of violence against religious minorities. The Southern Poverty Law Center has different ways of tracking religion-related hate groups and hate groups in general. And one thing that I would recommend to you all is to go on their website. They have an interactive map that shows active hate groups in different states in the United States. So you can click on your state and see which hate groups are active there. Not all of these are religion-related hate groups. Some of them are hate groups that are founded on based on racist sentiment, on homophobic sentiment. But it's important to it's helpful, I think, to go to this map to get a sense of how religion-related hate groups are operating in the United States. The good news, though, is that there is some evidence that by teaching about religion, we can actually decrease the bigotry and prejudice that fuel violence. So for a very long time in the United States, there was only one district in the entire country that required that all students take a standalone religious studies course before they graduate high school. And that district was in Modesto, California. Modesto is not a very progressive part of California. It's a quite conservative part of the state. And it has an interesting history why this district required the study of religion. But putting that aside for a moment, the good news is that researchers were really interested in finding out what was happening in this district because it was the only one requiring the study of religion. So they asked students a series of questions about their religious identity, whether that was changing, how this course of study was affecting their behaviors and attitudes as it relates to religion and religious freedom. in the United States. What they found is that students who went through the course did not become significantly more or less religious, but it did make them more likely to recognize the rights of others, including those with whom they strongly disagree. So we at the Religious Freedom Center take that to be very good news. It's at least one data point that shows us that when we teach about religion academically, we can decrease bigotry and prejudice that fuel violence without necessarily crossing an establishment clause boundary that would be inappropriate proselytization of students to try to make them all Christians, for example, or all Muslims or all atheists. That when students go through this course of study, they don't necessarily become significantly differently religious, but they do become more likely to recognize the rights of others. So how might we actually talk about religious identity in a way that is more academic? And the method that I'm going to be speaking about today is something that we use, I advocate very often for education about religion in an academic and constitutional way in American public schools. This matches the kind of framework that we use in public school settings. And in fact, when we talk about the importance of studying religion in schools, we try to emphasize 6 key learning objectives related to the academic study of religion. 3 of those are related to that video that you just saw from Andrew Henry, that religions are internally diverse, that they're dynamic and changing, and that they're embedded in culture. We call those 3 premises of religious studies. And then we also emphasize a 3B framework, which is really a framework for thinking about the complexity of religious identity, that religious identity isn't only about belief, it's also about behavior and communities of belonging. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So by way of background, I think it's helpful to take a look at this US Religious Knowledge Survey that Pew Research Center conducted in 2010. This survey was intended to ask questions that were representative of a body of important knowledge about religion. And what they found is that Americans who took the survey on average could only answer 16 of those 32 questions correctly. So on average, they got 50%. And those of us who remember our school days, or maybe some of us are in school, know that 50% on an exam isn't exactly a great score. So what a lot of people in the news, a lot of headlines emphasize that Americans are deeply religious. According to other metrics, Americans are more religious, for example, than Western Europeans. They're quite religious as a nation, but Americans don't know much about religion. So some groups made the claim that Americans are hypocrites, that they say that they're religious but don't know anything about religion. And in fact, if you look at the breakout by different communities, you see, for example, that atheists and agnostics scored higher on the survey than white evangelical Protestants or Black Protestants, for example. In the religious studies community, though, many of us didn't leave with a takeaway that Americans are hypocrites or that they don't know anything about religion. Instead, many religious studies scholars asked, when people self-identify as religious, what is important to them about that religious identity? If it's not about the kinds of things that were being asked on the survey, if they didn't know the answers to those questions, then perhaps the kinds of questions we were asking weren't trying to measure bodies of knowledge that were important to religious people in their own religious lives. So when we look at the survey, for example, the survey was asking a number of questions related to scriptural narrative and doctrine. So one question then we might leave with is scriptural narrative and doctrine actually important to the lives of religious people if they're not able to answer those questions correctly? So to try to answer that question, I did a very small scale study. This is not meant to be representative of the United States. It's meant to illustrate a certain point. So I did a very small study of a Catholic community in Providence, Rhode Island, and I asked them 3 kinds of questions. I asked them, how would you define or describe Catholicism to someone else? The second question was, how would you define or describe Islam to someone else? And the third question was, what's most important to you about being a Catholic? So in the first set of questions, I asked, how would you define or describe the religion of the self to the other? How would you define, and then the second question was, how would you define the religion of the other to someone else? And the third question was, how would you define or describe the religion of the self to yourself? What's most important to you? And I think that the findings are quite interesting. So when they were asked to talk about Catholicism, or define or describe Catholicism to someone else, they used the language of scriptural narrative and doctrine. They talked about it being founded by Christ and continued through apostolic succession. They talked about Jesus as the Savior or Son of God. They specifically used the language of it being a belief system or faith, the teachings of Jesus, the Holy Trinity, etc. Similarly, when they talked about Islam, when they were defining or describing Islam to someone else, they used the same set of descriptors, the same types of descriptors, I should say. They talked about Muhammad. They described Islam as a belief system or faith. They mentioned God or Allah. They mentioned the Quran as a holy book. And they talked about it being monotheist. So in terms of the types of descriptors that they were using, they were very similar descriptors to the descriptors when they were defining or describing Catholicism. And significantly, those were also similar to what they were using in the religious knowledge survey. So these descriptors related to scriptural narrative and doctrine. However, when they were asked to think about religion in their own lives, what was most important to them about being Catholics, they didn't use those descriptors as often, or at least the descriptors that they used were much more, there was a richer set of descriptors. So here I gave them a long list of different aspects of Catholicism that were important to them, or aspects of their Catholic identity. And it showed just a richer set of descriptors. So for example, many of them talked about Mass being the most important part of their religious identity. That was something that didn't come up at all when they were defining or describing Catholicism to someone else, but it was very important to them about being a Catholic. They talked about Catholic rites and rituals, weddings, funerals, baptisms. They talked about celebrating holidays, certain holidays with their family. Church teachings as they relate to social and moral values were important to them. So here we see a different set of descriptors. Instead of saying that they're grounding necessarily their religious identity in scriptural narrative and doctrine, some of them are at least pointing to other ways that they're grounding their religious identity, not just in the things that they believe, but also in the things that they do, their practices, both ritual and otherwise, and also in the communities that they belong to. To get a better sense of this, I think it's helpful to take a step back and look at some national surveys. So these are some national surveys that look at hot button issues that many of us associate with the Catholic Church. So these are doctrinal hot button issues that you might hear about in the news when you hear about the Catholic Church, things like same-sex marriage, the ordination of women, the use of birth control, allowing priests to get married, have sex and have children, and abortion. And I think many of us know what the institutional Catholic Church's stance is on these issues. We know that the institutional Catholic Church is against same-sex marriage, it's against the ordination of women, against the use of birth control, against abortion. What I think is very interesting is if you look at these national surveys conducted by Pew and PRRI, we find that the majority of American Catholics, of lay Catholics, disagree with the Catholic Church on every one of these issues. So the majority of American Catholics support same-sex marriage, they support the ordination of women, they support the use of birth control, they have a pro-choice stance, they support allowing women to have abortions, a slim majority. So we see that American Catholics aren't aligning with the Catholic Church on these doctrinal issues. So when we put on a religious studies hat, when I put on a religious studies hat, the questions that I ask related to this data isn't, are these good or bad Catholics, or are they not Catholics? I don't ask that evaluative question. Instead, I ask a question about that leads with why. Why do people who self-identify as Catholics claim a Catholic identity, claim an affiliation with the Catholic community if it's not for reasons of doctrine? And I think that trying to answer that question gives us also a good sense of the kind of knowledge that is important to be religiously literate. It's not necessarily about factual knowledge related to doctrine or scriptural narrative within specific religious traditions. When I think of religious literacy, it's more about how the American Academy of Religion defines it, which is the ability to discern and analyze the fundamental intersections of religion with social, political, and cultural life. This last data point I think is very interesting to me, even though it's the least statistically significant. So there was an international survey that was conducted by Wynne Gallup, and they were trying to look at trends related to the rise of atheism around the world. And people on the survey could self-identify however they wanted. They could say that they're atheist or agnostic, or they could say that they're Catholic or Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or Sikh or Baha'i or whatever it is that they might want, whatever descriptor that they might use. Among those at the beginning of the survey who self-identified as Catholic, later in the survey, when they were asked about belief in God, there was a measurable percentage, between 1% and 3%, who said that, who had self-identified as Catholic, but later said that they did not believe in God. So here again, we see the complexity of religious identity, that at least for those people, we know that they're not grounding their religious identity in their belief in God. So what is it grounded in? What does it mean for those people to call themselves Catholic? Why are they calling themselves Catholic? How do we make sense of that? And I think that the 3B framework that I've been alluding to is one way to make sense of that. We encourage at the Religious Freedom Center, and this comes out of also national education documents when thinking about how to teach about religion academically in public schools. I mentioned the 6-point framework. So Andrew Henry, he mentioned that religions are internally diverse, they're dynamic and changing, and they're embedded in culture. And here, we're thinking about this 3B framework for religious identity, that religious identity is not just grounded in the things that we believe, in our theologies, in our doctrines, and sacred narratives and holy texts. These things that we believe that we associate with religion per se, or even the things that we believe that we might not always associate primarily with religion, but are very intimately tied to our religious beliefs, our social values and ethics, for example. Or as we saw with Natalie when she was presenting the data about the religious landscape in the United States, she was pointing to the close linkages between perhaps political beliefs and religious beliefs. So there are beliefs, certainly, but then also there's behaviors. And by behaviors, we mean not only our rites and rituals that we might do in a house of worship or in a sacred setting, but also our habits and daily practices, the things that we do every day over and over again with our bodies that we might not necessarily think of as religious, but that are deeply and intimately connected with our religious identities. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. And then finally, religious identity includes not just the community of belonging that we're naming when we say I'm, Catholic or Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish or Jain, those kinds of communities of belonging for religious communities, but also it includes the ways that those communities of belonging intersect with our racial, ethnic, familial, gender, sexual, and other identities. Again, thinking back to Natalie's presentation when she was talking about why demographers break out, or political scientists break out these statistics not only based on religion, but also race. So when she talked about white Christians versus non-white Christians, or white evangelicals versus Hispanic evangelicals or Black evangelicals or whatever it might be, we do that because we recognize that our communities of belonging are the things that we think of as religious and not religious are very deeply connected. So that when we think about religious belonging, we need to be thinking about it in the context of all the other ways that humans are forming communities, are building relationships with one another. So one diagram to illustrate this relationship and the connection between belief, behavior, belonging is this, and I borrow this from a scholar named Jonathan Haidt. So on the left, we see that beliefs are shaping behaviors. So this is a very common way for all of us, I think, to think about religious identity, and it comes out of the Protestant Enlightenment, that we believe certain things and therefore we behave in a certain way. So I might say, for example, that I'm a Christian, I'm a rational human being, I read the Bible, and through reason I come to understand what God is and what God wants for the world, and therefore I behave charitably, that there's a flow from my beliefs to my behaviors. Religious studies scholars over the past century and more have really tried to understand and make sense of religious identity in a bit more of a complex way, that sometimes our beliefs are shaping our behaviors, but sometimes our behaviors shape our beliefs. So an example of this, I have met a number of Catholic priests who, when asked by lapsed Catholics, what they should do because they no longer believe in the doctrines of the church, I've met a number of Catholic priests who said, go to Mass, participate in the Eucharist, and by going through these rituals of the church, these sacraments of the church again and again, you will come to understand what it means to be Catholic, that through these behaviors, you'll arrive at certain understanding of Catholic belief. Or I've met Zen Buddhists who have said, in order to understand certain truths about reality, you actually have to start with seated meditation, that it's through this practice of seated meditation that you'll come to understand beliefs. Or using an example of a practice that's not necessarily so easily located in religion, imagine what it might be like to grow up in a culture in which it's the social norm to bow to someone who's considered your social superior. How might that physical act of bowing again and again, even before you know why it is you do what you do, how might that actually shape the way that you understand your relationship with not only other humans, but also with the divine, for example? And then there's communities of belonging. We often, I think, in the United States at least, think of beliefs shaping our communities of belonging, that we believe certain things and therefore find communities to belong to of others who believe those things. But sometimes it's our communities of belonging that shape our beliefs. And there have been a number of religious studies scholars and theologians who have pointed this out. One example I often give is of James Cone, who is considered the father of Black liberation theology in the United States. And in a book he wrote called A Black Theology of Liberation, he has a section called The Sources and Norms of Black Theology. And he asks, what are the sources and norms? And he says that number one, the first source of Black theology, it's not belief in Jesus, it's not the Bible, it's actually the Black experience, that you can't understand what it means to who God is, what God wants, what God means for the world, without starting with the experience of Black people who have been oppressed in the United States by systemic and structural racism. So there are different ways of thinking about belief, behavior, belonging. But what's important is that we hopefully we take away from this a consideration of the ways that these different aspects of religious identity are shaping one another. They're informing one another. They're mutually constitutive. They're constantly in conversation. And so why this, I think, is helpful for us is really because as the religious landscape, it becomes more diverse, as we have to think about, what does it mean to live together with our deepest differences? What does it mean to navigate an increasingly religiously diverse country? It's helpful to not only think about diversity at the level of the affiliations that we claim. If we say I'm Jewish and you're Christian, for example, if we only think about diversity at the level of those, affiliative markers or names, then we're actually missing a good deal of the religious diversity and complexity in the United States. Because it might be that I, as a Jew, and you, as a Baptist, use different language to talk about our beliefs, but our beliefs are really important to us. Or maybe I, as a Jew, and you, as a Baptist, care more about our behaviors than our beliefs. And that might actually be a way of trying to understand similarities between us, even if we use different language, different vocabulary words to describe our beliefs or our behavior. Or somewhat similarly, I might be, a Sunni Muslim, and next to me is another Sunni Muslim, and we might see that as a similarity, that we both claim this particular affiliation, but we might miss the diversity there because I, as a Sunni Muslim, might care more about the community that I belong to as a Pakistani Sunni Muslim versus the person next to me who might care more about their beliefs and not think about the fact that they're, an Arab Muslim or an Indonesian hyphenated Muslim. There might be different ways that people are thinking about religious identity. So that's hopefully a new way of thinking about both religious similarity and complexity in the United States, that we don't want to just be thinking about the names that we attach to religious affiliation. We also want to be thinking about how people are forming their religious identity and whether that gives us ground for looking at similarity and difference in different kinds of ways.
Wow. Ben, you have some questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Going to questions in the chat. I see a question from Yuri about how did I come up with these survey questions. So what I wanted to, I think you're talking about the how would you define or describe Catholicism, Islam, and then Catholicism in your own life. What I wanted to see was whether we in the United States speak about religion in different ways than we actually experience it. So one of the things that I wanted to find out is when we talk about religion to other people, if someone says, for example, oh, you're Catholic, I've never met a Catholic, tell me about that. My hypothesis was that we train people to describe our own traditions in ways that are quite different than how we experience it in our own lives. So for example, if someone had asked some of our respondents, how would you define or describe Catholicism? They might say something about belief in Jesus and apostolic succession and 10 Commandments, which is very different from that person might not actually care as much about the 10 Commandments. For them, it might actually be important to them as a Catholic to go to church, to go to Mass. And so I wanted to try to understand this, whether there was a disconnect between how we define or describe religion to other people, whether it's our own religion or someone else, and then how we experience that in our own lives. I see a question from Paula about how would you prepare public schools teachers to instruct world religion? So this is the main part of my job, is thinking about how to train and equip educators to teach about religion in academic and constitutional ways. I actually, just this morning, was presenting to a summer institute for educators to help them think about how to teach about religion in public schools. And so we are big advocates of training educators both at the pre-service level before they get into the classroom and at the in-service level once they're already in the classroom. And so we try to equip them with these conceptual frameworks that come out of the academic field of religious studies. So exactly what I just presented to you and what you heard from Andrew Henry, those are the 6 key points that we want teachers to understand. And then we help them think about how do you apply those to lesson plans in the classroom that will help students understand the nuances of religious identity. And I saw that Ellie really helpfully posted a link to the Religious Freedom Center website. Thank you, Ellie, for doing that. If you have more questions about how we train and equip educators, if you are an educator yourself, I'd be happy to continue the conversation and direct you to some of my colleagues who do that kind of training. All right. Sorry, Stephen, that I speak so quickly. I had a lot of content that I wanted to cover. I apologize, it might have been too much content. The good news is that Blair is recording this session, so if I said anything too quickly and you want to go back to it, Blair, I'm sure can share that recording with you, but I apologize.
No, and I think that Andrew Henry set the tone. I mean, did he not talk as fast as a human being can possibly? And that probably kind of revved you up, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that is a good reminder to slow down sometimes. So Shane asked a question, do you believe that age plays a role in the divide between the beliefs of the church versus beliefs of the individual? I think there's a lot of different ways to answer this question. One thing that I'll say is that it will be interesting. I'm glad that there are people like Natalie and organizations like the Public Religion Research Institute that are tracking attitudes about religion in the United States and religious affiliation. I do think it will be quite interesting to see how affiliation changes as people in the 18 to 29 age group now get older, and then to see how today's toddlers up through 18, what their religious affiliation is like when they're 18 to 29. We'll see whether people disaffiliate or choose not to affiliate or don't affiliate with religious communities because they disagree with institutional religious organizations on certain doctrinal stances like same-sex marriage, for example, or whether they will continue to affiliate but will sort of form their own sub-communities within those communities based on their own beliefs and ideas about social values and ethics. I don't know. I imagine it's not, what is the factor? Is it age? I don't think so, because we saw that young people in earlier generations weren't as unaffiliated. Is it something to do with the fact that today's 18 to 29-year-olds are in a really racially and ethnically diverse age cohort, and that encounter of difference and encounter of different kinds of cultures and ways of living is leading to new ideas about what it means to belong to a religious community? I don't know. So I hope that answers your question, Shane, but it's a complicated question with a complicated answer. And so I would direct you more to Natalie's work and work of groups like PRRI. Adina asks a question, and this will be the last question. I want to turn it over to Blair. I know I'm running low on time. Do you have any suggestions for or resources on improving religious literacy and sensitivity in the workplace? I'm so glad you asked that question, and that I think is a good plug for week 3 of this series. So Blair mentioned next week talking about Christian nationalism and the conversations you'll have next week. In week 3, my colleague and Blair's colleague, Paul Lambert, will be talking about religious literacy and religious freedom in the workplace. That'll be the main focus of that week, and he'll give you plenty of resources about that. And Ellie also linked to our partner organization in that work, religiousfreedominbusiness.org, which is a really great resource as well. So
thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. That was just, that was wonderful. And I hope that everyone is going to leave this program today with some new knowledge and also some new things to think about. And for myself, when we get out from under the COVID, lockdown situation we're in now, I think it would be so interesting to go back to that. I think it was the first slide that Natalie showed us, when people responded to the question, do you think different institutions push people apart or bring people together? And as I recall, religious institutions were doing more pushing apart than maybe we would have expected. It'd be really interesting to see how people of who emphasize different aspects of belief, behavior, belonging feel on that particular question. I think it would be interesting to know. So we've come to the close of our time here, and I hope that you all join us at this time next week, right back here. You'll get an email from me tomorrow with a registration link. We have a wonderful panel put together of 5 individuals from different faith traditions who are going to tell their personal stories about their experience with religious freedom here in America. And as I mentioned, we're also going to talk about Christian nationalism, what exactly it is and what it means. And then on the 3rd Thursday, as Ben mentioned, July 30th, we're going to be delving into the issue of religious diversity in the workplace. What are some things that have come up in actual workplaces that people have had to deal with, how they dealt with them, and how we might empower ourselves to be effective in the workplace. So I look forward to everyone participating in those, and please share the information with friends in your network. So please join me in thanking our panel. Each one of them delivered their content right on time, which is a big achievement in my mind. And we thank you, Ben, and thank you, Natalie, and we thank the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations for supporting us, and we thank each of you for participating this afternoon, and I'll see you next week.